what I'd like to do is just sort of share with you a little bit of perspective on some of the work that I've been doing. I don't know about you, but before you get into grand theory, I'm always kind of like, something has to fly at the level of actual people that I've been working with or know. And so if I could, I just wanted to take you into where my head starts on these ideas. And a few years ago, I was fortunate to work with the World Bank's Human Development Branch and do some consulting with them. And my role was to go around the globe and help spur resilience-promoting programs, often in educational settings. And among the people I was honored to meet were two university professors from Afghanistan. This was actually, a picture comes from Nepal, where we brought together people from Syria and Bhutan, and Afghanistan, India, et cetera, et cetera. What inspired me about the work that we do is these two women, you can see sitting there right next to me on the right-hand side. They were trying to get young women to go to university and college in Afghanistan. And the barriers that those young women faced were unbelievable. Not only did they have to help these young women change their mindsets about, to see themselves and develop new identities as educated women who can contribute, then they had to deal with all the structural barriers, including fathers, systems of patriarchy, housing problems, transportation problems. And then they told me that even after they negotiated all those barriers, many of the young women that they got to university were dropping out very quickly. And the reason they said was that once they got to the university, what they had not anticipated was that the young women were developing a number of physical ailments because there were no toilets built at the universities for women to use. So these two university professors then told me that what they had to do was then negotiate with the universities to build toilets for the women. So when people talk to me about resilience, and it's not uncommon to hear sometimes the rhetoric of our field is, just have people believe in themselves, these superficial kind of explanations, which are really more appropriate for positive psychology than for the field of resilience. I often say, well, actually, changing your mindset is one thing, but building someone a toilet is actually sometimes far more important. And so, therefore, what I've been really playing with in my work is, at the Resilience Research Center, we've been trying to understand this combination of how, in a sense, understanding risk factors and the protective processes that engage with them, and therefore what kind of outcomes you want. And when you begin to think in this kind of three-column system, which I always find is just the simplest way I can boil it down, because that's what you want to know. You want to know which protective mechanism, as we've seen, for which constellation of factors, risk factors, is going to produce the desired outcome. And when you begin to think like this, then suddenly you can do something kind of wacky like diagnose resilience. I did this, I actually managed to get this published in a rather good journal for psychiatry and psychology. I'm actually stunned they actually published this, but they did. Because it's kind of like basically saying that we can diagnose resilience if we take a, sort of a differential diagnosis approach. And what I thought was, well, you have to first start talking about adversity, right? You have to know about the severity, the chronicity that people's experiences. At what ecological level? Do you just have a learning challenge, or do you have a learning challenge and living in poverty? Just as, if I might borrow what you just sort of outlined. You're going to need to know our attribution styles, and as well as cultural and contextual factors. And when you begin to put all that together, what we begin to understand is that if you're going to understand resilience, as we've seen, you really need to know, are you talking about resilience in a lower risk environment or a higher risk environment? And I'm going to argue that in low risk environments, changes in cognition, mindset, grit, all those kinds of individualizing discursive elements that we so often hear promoted by Oprah and others, no offense to Oprah, I kind of think she's cool, is very much what you need. What you often see is that's good when risk factors are relatively uncomplicated. But as risk increases and in higher risk contexts, then what you're really talking about is what other resources are available, accessible, how can you use them strategically, what kind of reinforcement from one's community is there, and indeed what is the capacity of your environment, not just you individually, but your environment to basically create the conditions that you need. So when I hear about what's going on in Washington State, or absolutely amazing, what we're talking about is higher levels of risk exposure, seeking a certain kind of outcome, and therefore to diagnose resilience, we've really got to account for the risk factors as well as the mechanisms that are most telling. And this kind of gets into, like, if you will, a really interesting definition. And resilience then becomes this idea of, well, our capacity in a context where there's exposure to adversity, our capacity to navigate, to make our way to the resources we need, as well as, of course, to negotiate for what we need in ways that, frankly, are culturally meaningful. Now, this is the work that we've been, at the Resilience Research Center, have been leading for more than a decade, but 2 words, right? Navigation, you need to be able to find what you need, and if I might, this other concept of negotiation, which opens the field to this kind of discursive back and forth. We kind of got to ask, like those young women in Afghanistan, it's just not enough to say, okay, we've got you to the university. Oh yeah, you've actually negotiated. You also need a bathroom. I asked Jennifer if I could extend my time by 2 minutes just to sort of give you a little energizer, because I love to show this idea of negotiation in 3 dimensions. And as a little energizer here this afternoon, have you ever played mirrors with your clients or people you work with? You know mirrors? Hi, would you play a game of mirrors with me for a second? Sure. Okay, stand up. All right, so hi, I'm going to, just one person is going to be the leader. Okay, I've done this exercise with senators and politicians, all kinds of people. If you can just, one person is the leader, and hi, just go palm to palm, you don't have to touch. And if I move my hand, you have to move your hand. If I smile, you gotta smile, etc., etc., etc. That's mirror. Would you humor me just for a second? I have a point to this. Would you, for literally 10 seconds, try a game of mirrors or something? One person is the leader. Just try it. Pause. I'd like you to do, okay, part two of the exercise, revenge time. The other person gets the lead. Okay, wait, pause, part three. Can you go back now to that very first position? And this time, without deciding who's going to lead and who's going to follow, could you just start? Just go back to the first position. And don't decide who's going to lead and who's going to follow. Just start. All right, thank you. It can almost be painful watching people try to do that. What I found, when we designed large-scale resilience studies all over the globe, and what we've actually been doing is finding that that third experience I just gave you of negotiation is actually what happens in our studies. People enter a situation where they don't know who's going to lead and who's going to follow. You enter a community and you have to ask, what is the most salient protective mechanism that you need? And then we as researchers and responders and clinicians and policymakers are trying to figure out, and of course it's not just what the community says. We're scientists too, so we have some other kinds of wisdom, whether that's indigenized knowledge or otherwise. We come to that situation with some histories. And the science of resilience, I think, is helping us to understand is it's a negotiation between what a community says it needs and what are realistically available. And if I could, we're seeing that there are patterns to this knowledge. We do see repeating patterns globally in our work, including that resilience tend to be nurturing of relationships, helping people negotiate powerful identities, building experiences of efficacy, power and control. Promoting social justice is a big part of the models that we propel. Basic material resources, promoting social cohesion to echo the sense of coherence that Shanta recently talked about, as well as just your basic cultural continuity or adherence. And what we're actually seeing is, I'm not actually going to do this because I won't have the time, but this is an example from Japan. But I did want to sort of just bring you to a basic model. And that model is that we're beginning to understand we have to think about resilience in much more systemic, multisystemic ways. One of our big research studies now is a longitudinal study in 2 oil and gas producing towns, one in Alberta, Canada, and the other in South Africa. And what we're looking at is young people's experience over time biologically. We're using hair cortisol as a biological marker of stress. We're talking psychosocial factors, and we're even measuring the environment around these kids. And we're trying to develop more complex models to look at protective mechanisms across all those different systemic levels. Because those communities are going to disappear, right? Every time you see a Tesla, their fate are sealed. Whether we want to believe it or not, whether or not you want to open coal mines or whatever, the fact is, the world is moving. And these communities, without diversification, are going to suffer huge consequences and social displacement. So we're trying to understand these particular trends at these multisystemic levels. So essentially, we've been also using our own measures of the CYRM. We've been trying to sort of develop sort of tools. I'm not going to go into that because I think a lot of you are sort of familiar with what we've been doing with that. But I did want to sort of give you an example of the application of some of these ideas when you start thinking about it. So we were working with a lot of very high-risk individuals. One part of a study that we did several years ago across 5 different countries was to look at children who are using multiple services. This is just the Canadian data. And what we were trying to figure out was, what's the connection between contextual risk exposure, when you're in bad, quote-unquote bad, that's not fair, but heavily burdened environments, when you have personal challenges, when we also ask you about the number of services that you've had access to over your lifetime, and finally, of course, if I might, what's been your service use experience? And what we found with some really interesting points is that actually having a really good service use experience is a conduit for developing those 7 things I just talked about, those 7 aspects, positive relationships, sets of efficacy, all these other things. That what we found was that when you come into a services environment, you're actually developing, potentially, a very healthy and positive experience that bolsters your resilience that then changes particular outcomes. One of the things that we found was more services did not equal better outcomes. It was the quality of the services you actually got. And herein lies, again, this dynamic. If you think about highly, people who've been suffered the effects of colonization, or genocide, or migration, or etc., what you're really talking about is a need to account for their experiences of the actual environment in which we come to them to try and help. Now, if I could, the other big idea that we've been playing with a little bit, and it has actually been published in Child Abuse and Neglect, we had, as someone mentioned earlier, I think Angela mentioned we had a special issue on this, was this notion of differential impact. We've been presenting this as kind of a little bit like do something with resilience and produce really good outcomes. But when you dig deeper into the science on this, what we're actually seeing is a far more complicated story when you disaggregate the data. Now, this is not my data. This is borrowed from the special issue of Child Abuse and Neglect that Linda Theron and I put out recently, or co-edited or whatever. And when Yu Young Kwok and that whole team looked at this, how you guys, everyone does these programs where we give mentors to young people to be better, their better selves, right? And we expect that those work. And for most children who experience child sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect, etc., the trend is good. It actually works. And, right, they get better. They tend to report less depressive symptoms, except if you've been sexually abused. If you're running a program that you're mentoring young people with adults, you're actually harming the children. You could be, let me put this, you could be harming the children who have been sexually abused. And herein lies the more sophisticated ideas that we're getting to as we think about the risk exposures, protective mechanisms, and very specific outcomes. We can do the same thing with delinquency, where actually the children who've been sexually abused actually got better in terms of delinquency, but the children who experienced some sort of emotional neglect actually got worse. So, if I could, I just want to give you one last image. So much of what we talk about in our field is, fortunately, we are finally making it more complicated. We aren't just sort of getting back to that notion of the invulnerable child that Anthony wrote about in 1987. We're suddenly thinking in much more sophisticated models. And I love that, because, look, the truth is, I've worked all over the globe, and this is back about a dozen years ago when I was in Tanzania with my colleagues there, developing some of these ideas. And my daughter was traveling with me at that time, and she went to school with some of the children of my colleagues, and I snapped this photo during the lunch hour. I went back to find her, and I snapped this photo of her one lunch hour, and if you can't pick her out, by the way, my daughter is the 5th one. Never? No? I love the photo for a very specific reason. My daughter is outnumbered on that bench. And I hate to say it, but the work that we do is we have focused too much on my daughter. And we have not yet fully explored the experiences and the protective mechanisms that explain the resilience of the other girls sitting, or other children, indeed, sitting on that bench. And that becomes our role now. Children with disabilities, our indigenous populations around the world, children who are migrants. In Canada, we have 43,000 Syrian refugees. We have a multi-million-dollar study now of their experiences as they've come into our country. These are the future of our field, and indeed of the kind of work that you're doing to ask what kind of risks, what kind of protective mechanisms, in what context, for what outcomes that we're actually striving for. And on that note, thank you very much.